The night my ex-husband realized who I had become began with a single sentence that froze an entire ballroom. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly as if searching my memory, while the crystal chandeliers above us scattered warm light across hundreds of silent faces. Moments earlier the room had been alive with polite laughter and the soft clinking of champagne glasses, the kind of quiet luxury you only find in Manhattan's most exclusive galas, where the guest list reads like a map of the city's power. 500 people filled the grand ballroom of the Astoria Grand Hotel that evening, dressed in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns, gathered for a charity event that had raised more than $1 billion in pledged investments and philanthropic funds. At the center of it all stood me, Emily Carter, the woman hosting the gala, the founder of the fastest-growing design technology company in the country, and according to a recent magazine cover, the quiet billionaire who rebuilt herself from nothing. But none of those titles were the reason the room had suddenly gone silent. The silence came from the man standing 3 feet in front of me. Daniel Hayes. 8 years ago he had been my husband. The man who once believed he understood exactly how my life would end. The man who had looked at me across a dinner table and said with absolute certainty that I would never succeed without him. Now he stood in the middle of a ballroom funded by the company I built, holding a half-finished glass of champagne, staring at me like he had just seen a ghost walk into the room, wearing a couture evening gown and a billion-dollar smile. Around us, conversations faded into whispers as people slowly realized something unusual was happening. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, the kind that creeps in slowly when the mind refuses to believe what the eyes are seeing. 8 years had changed both of us. His hair was shorter now, threaded slightly with gray at the temples, and the confident lawyer's smile he once carried so easily seemed uncertain tonight. As for me, the woman he had once known barely existed anymore. The Emily Carter he married had lived in a small Brooklyn apartment and spent late nights sketching business ideas in notebooks no one else ever read. The woman standing before him tonight wore a midnight blue silk gown and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had learned how to survive disappointment, rebuild her life from scratch, and turn quiet determination into something powerful enough to reshape her entire future. But Daniel didn't know that story yet. All he knew was that the woman he once left behind had somehow become the most important person in the room, and the realization was spreading through the crowd like a ripple across still water. I watched the moment land in his eyes, the exact second when recognition collided with disbelief. His lips parted as if he wanted to say my name again, but the words never came. Instead, he simply stared, and in that stillness the past and the present stood face to face beneath a ceiling of crystal light, while the entire ballroom waited to see what would happen next. For several seconds Daniel Hayes did not move, and that stillness was almost louder than the music that had quietly stopped behind us. I could see the calculation happening in his eyes, the slow process of matching the woman standing in front of him with the memory of someone he once knew. 8 years ago, I had been someone entirely different. Back then I wore thrift store dresses and carried a laptop that overheated every time I opened too many design files. Back then my biggest audience had been a handful of freelance clients who paid me late and rarely read the ideas I spent nights creating. Tonight the same hands that once sketched business plans at a tiny kitchen table were hosting a gala that had just secured more than $1 billion in philanthropic commitments. Around us the ballroom lights reflected off polished marble floors and towering glass windows that looked out across the Manhattan skyline. People who ran banks, technology companies, and international charities filled the room, and many of them were watching Daniel now with quiet curiosity, waiting to see why he looked as if he had stepped into the wrong story. He finally cleared his throat, still staring at me. The confident tone I remembered from years ago was missing, replaced by a careful uncertainty. He said my name again, softer this time, as though speaking it might confirm that the impossible scene in front of him was real. Emily. The sound of it floated between us, but it did not carry the authority it once had. I studied his face for a moment, not with anger and not with triumph, but with the calm detachment that time sometimes gives to memories that once hurt deeply. 8 years earlier Daniel Hayes had been a rising corporate attorney with a polished reputation and an impressive office view of downtown Manhattan. People listened when he spoke. Colleagues admired his ambition, and during those years he had often reminded me that our future depended on his success. He liked to explain things in careful, reasonable sentences, the way lawyers do when they believe they are presenting an obvious truth. He used to say that stability mattered more than dreams, that practical careers built real lives, and that ideas without investors were simply hobbies. At the time, I believed him. I believed many things he said because when you love someone, you sometimes mistake confidence for wisdom. A few guests nearby had begun whispering quietly now, their curiosity spreading through the room as more people recognized the tension in Daniel's posture and the calm composure in mine. One woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and murmured something while glancing in our direction. Daniel noticed the attention as well. I could see it in the way his shoulders straightened slightly, as though instinctively trying to recover the confident presence he once carried into every room. But the difference tonight was simple and unmistakable. 8 years ago, Daniel Hayes had been the most successful person in our marriage. Tonight, he stood inside a world I had built without him, surrounded by people who had come not to see him, but to see me. The truth was that the story Daniel believed about our past had always been incomplete. Years earlier, before the suits and the headlines and the investors who now filled this ballroom, our life together had been much smaller and much quieter. We lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn on the 4th floor of a brick building that overlooked a narrow street lined with coffee shops and old bookstores. The place measured barely 800 square feet, but at the time it felt like the beginning of something hopeful. Daniel worked long hours at a downtown law firm and often returned home after 9 in the evening carrying the exhaustion of court, filings and client meetings. I spent my days designing freelance projects on a small desk positioned beside the window, chasing ideas that rarely turned into real opportunities. At night, the glow from my laptop would fill the living room while Daniel reviewed legal documents at the kitchen table. For a while, it almost felt balanced. We were both building something, even if the scale of those ambitions looked very different. Daniel liked structure, measurable progress, and the certainty of a career that followed predictable steps. Promotions came with titles, salaries increased in clear increments, and success could be explained through numbers. My world looked nothing like that. My ideas existed in sketches and digital prototypes that lived quietly on hard drives and notebooks. Some nights I would excitedly show Daniel a concept I believed could turn into a real platform one day. I would explain how designers across the country struggled with the same problems and how technology could simplify the entire process. Daniel would listen politely at first, leaning back in his chair with the calm expression he used whenever he believed he was being supportive. But after a few minutes, he usually smiled in a way that felt more patient than enthusiastic. He would remind me that new companies required serious investors, complex legal structures, and connections that people like us did not have. He would say it gently, the way someone explains reality to a person who has not yet learned how the world works. According to Daniel, success followed rules that had already been written, and my ideas lived outside those rules. At the time, I told myself that his doubts were simply practical advice. After all, he was the one with the stable career, the respected colleagues, and the impressive office view overlooking the East River. I was the one chasing possibilities that had not yet become anything real. Yet there were moments when his confidence created a quiet distance between us. I remember one evening when a group of Daniel's colleagues joined us for dinner at a restaurant near his office. They spoke easily about promotions, investments, and property purchases in neighborhoods I had never visited. Someone eventually asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Daniel laughed lightly and explained that I was exploring a few creative ideas while he handled the serious responsibilities in our household. The table chuckled politely, and the conversation moved on, but I felt something shift inside me that night. It was a small moment that no one else seemed to notice, yet it carried a weight that lingered long after we returned home. That was the first time I began to understand that Daniel did not see my future the way I did. In his mind, my ambitions were temporary distractions, pleasant but unrealistic dreams that would eventually fade as adulthood settled in. And standing here now beneath the bright chandeliers of a ballroom filled with people who believed in the company I built, I realized that the distance between those two versions of our lives had quietly grown wider than either of us ever imagined. That dinner was not the only moment when Daniel's confidence quietly reshaped the way people saw me. Over time, those small comments began to appear more often, always delivered with the same calm smile that made them sound harmless. If friends asked about my projects, Daniel would explain that I was experimenting with creative hobbies while he focused on building a real career. When family members visited our apartment, he would casually mention that stability came from practical decisions, not risky ideas that might never work. Each remark sounded reasonable on its own, yet together they slowly formed a narrative that I had never agreed to. In Daniel's version of our life, he was the architect of our future, and I was simply the supportive partner waiting beside him while he built it. I remember one particular evening that still stands out clearly in my mind. Daniel's law firm was hosting a celebration at a private club overlooking the Hudson River. The event marked a major promotion for one of the senior partners, and many of the firm's top clients had been invited. Daniel insisted that I attend with him, explaining that appearances mattered in his profession and that spouses were expected to show support at important gatherings. The club itself looked like something from an old movie about New York wealth. Tall windows framed the river outside, polished wood panels lined the walls, and waiters moved quietly between groups of guests carrying trays of sparkling drinks. I wore a simple navy dress that I had purchased during a sale earlier that week, hoping it would look appropriate among the expensive suits and elegant gowns around us. At first, the evening passed politely. Daniel introduced me to several colleagues who shook my hand and asked friendly questions about where we lived and how long we had been married. Eventually, a small circle formed near the bar where a few attorneys were discussing business ventures and new technology investments. One of them asked if anyone in the group had experience working with design software companies. The question caught my attention immediately because it touched on the exact concept I had been developing for months. I began explaining an idea about creating a platform that could simplify the way designers collaborate with clients across different cities. For a brief moment, the conversation turned toward me, and I could feel a spark of excitement as people listened. Then Daniel laughed softly and placed his hand on my shoulder. He told the group that I was known for imaginative concepts, and that our household had many late-night brainstorming sessions that usually ended with very ambitious dreams. His tone was friendly, but the effect was unmistakable. The conversation shifted away from my explanation almost instantly. Someone joked that every entrepreneur needed a visionary partner at home, and the group returned to discussing more traditional investments. I stood there smiling politely while the energy of that moment faded into background noise. Daniel never intended cruelty in those situations. In his mind, he was simply being realistic, protecting me from the disappointment that he believed came with chasing ideas too big for our circumstances. But that night, as we rode the elevator down from the club to the street below, I understood something clearly for the first time. Daniel did not just doubt my future. He had already decided what it would be. The months that followed that evening at the private club were quiet on the surface, yet something inside me had begun to change in a way Daniel did not notice. Life in our Brooklyn apartment continued as it always had. Daniel left early each morning in a pressed suit, and returned late carrying the steady confidence of someone whose career moved forward exactly as planned. I remained at my small desk beside the window, working through freelance assignments while slowly building a collection of ideas that only existed inside notebooks and prototype files. But after that night by the Hudson River, I stopped seeking Daniel's approval for those ideas. Instead of explaining every concept to him, I began developing them quietly on my own, testing possibilities after midnight while the city outside our window grew calm. During the day, I researched how technology companies were being built, reading articles about entrepreneurs who had once started with little more than an idea and a stubborn belief that something better could exist. I learned about venture funding, early-stage platforms, and the way digital tools were reshaping creative industries across the country. The more I studied, the clearer my vision became. Designers everywhere faced the same challenge I had experienced during freelance work. Communication with clients was scattered across emails, file-sharing services, and endless revisions that wasted time and energy. I began sketching a platform that could bring everything into one place, a system that would allow creative professionals to collaborate with clients in a single streamlined environment. It was an ambitious concept, far beyond anything I had attempted before, and that was exactly why I kept it to myself. Daniel continued to believe that my work consisted of small freelance projects that helped cover everyday expenses. Occasionally, he would ask about my latest assignments, and I would answer with polite simplicity, describing routine design work instead of the larger plan forming on my screen each night. In truth, the secrecy was not meant to deceive him. It was simply easier than defending an idea he had already decided would fail. One evening, about 6 months after the firm's celebration by the river, Daniel arrived home earlier than usual. I remember the sound of his keys landing on the kitchen counter and the confident energy in his voice as he described a new opportunity at the law firm. A senior partner had recommended him for a major client account, a case that could significantly accelerate his career. He spoke with excitement about the future, about larger responsibilities, and about the lifestyle that success would eventually provide. I listened carefully while he explained the possibilities, and I truly meant it when I told him I was proud of his progress. But as he talked, I realized something important about the path he was describing. In Daniel's world, success followed a ladder that had already been built by others. You climbed each step carefully, gained experience, and eventually reached the level that people like him believed was the natural destination. My path was beginning to look very different. The platform I was designing had no ladder, no predictable route, and no guarantee that it would succeed. All it had was potential and the quiet determination growing inside me every night after Daniel went to sleep. And although he did not know it then, those quiet nights were slowly becoming the foundation of a future that would one day bring both of us back into the same room under very different circumstances. The first real fracture in our marriage did not arrive with shouting or dramatic arguments the way people often imagine. Instead, it came quietly, through a conversation that felt calm on the surface but carried a finality that neither of us could ignore. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening, almost a year after the night at the club overlooking the Hudson River. The city outside our apartment windows looked blurred under streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, and the familiar hum of traffic drifted up from the street below. Daniel had returned home earlier than usual again, but this time his expression carried a seriousness that immediately caught my attention. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase on the kitchen counter, and asked if we could talk. I closed my laptop slowly, saving the prototype files that had become the center of my nightly routine, and joined him at the small dining table where we had shared hundreds of ordinary meals together. For a moment, he seemed to search for the right words, as though rehearsing a careful explanation that he believed would sound reasonable once spoken aloud. When he finally began, his voice was calm and measured, the same tone he used in professional meetings. He explained that his career was entering an important phase, that new opportunities required a certain lifestyle and social presence, and that the future he was building demanded stability. At first, his words sounded like a continuation of the same conversations we had shared many times before, discussions about ambition and responsibility. But gradually the direction of the conversation became clear. Daniel believed our lives were moving in different directions. He spoke about compatibility, about practical expectations, and about the reality that some people simply wanted different things from life. Throughout the conversation, he never raised his voice and never said anything openly cruel. In fact, he seemed convinced that he was delivering a thoughtful and mature explanation for a decision that had already been made in his mind. According to Daniel, our marriage had been built during a time when we were both still discovering our paths. Now that his path had become clear, he believed it was unfair to both of us to continue pretending that we shared the same future. I listened quietly as the meaning of his words settled into the room between us. Outside, the rain continued tapping softly against the window glass while the city lights reflected across the floor of our living room. When Daniel finished speaking, the apartment felt strangely calm, almost peaceful, as though the decision he had carried inside for weeks had finally been released. He told me that he had already begun looking for a new apartment closer to his office, and that he believed a respectful separation would allow both of us to pursue the lives we truly wanted. I remember studying his face during that moment, noticing how certain he appeared about the logic of his decision. In Daniel's mind, this conversation was not about failure or betrayal. It was simply a practical adjustment to reality. The life he envisioned no longer included the uncertain dreams of the woman sitting across from him. What he could not see was that those uncertain dreams had already begun quietly transforming into something far more powerful than either of us understood at the time. The weeks after Daniel moved out felt strangely quiet, as if the apartment itself was adjusting to a new reality. His suits were gone from the closet, his shoes no longer lined the hallway shelf, and the space that once held his briefcase beside the kitchen counter now stood empty. At first the silence felt heavy, not because of anger or resentment, but because routine had vanished overnight. For years our lives had followed the same pattern of schedules and conversations, and suddenly that structure no longer existed. I spent the first few days reorganizing the apartment simply to give myself something practical to do. I moved my desk closer to the window where the morning light filled the room and stacked my notebooks beside the laptop that had quietly become the center of my world. Without Daniel's evening routines shaping the apartment, the nights became longer and strangely more productive. I worked through ideas with a focus that had never been possible before, refining the platform design that had slowly grown from scattered sketches into something that resembled a real system. The concept was no longer just a dream about improving communication between designers and clients. It was beginning to look like a functioning digital environment where projects, revisions, and creative feedback could exist in one organized space. The more I worked, the more confident I became that the idea solved a real problem people faced every day. Yet confidence did not immediately translate into opportunity. Building technology required resources I did not have. My freelance work barely covered rent and basic expenses, and the thought of launching a real platform felt almost impossible when I considered the cost of development and servers. Still, I continued working late into the night because progress itself became a source of energy. Every improvement to the design made the idea feel more tangible. One afternoon about 3 months after the separation, I attended a small technology networking event held in a shared workspace building in Midtown. I had almost convinced myself not to go. The event was advertised as a casual gathering for startup founders and investors, and the idea of presenting my concept to strangers felt intimidating. But something inside me insisted that the next step required leaving the safety of my apartment and letting someone else see the work I had been building. The room was modest compared to the grand events I had once attended with Daniel. Folding chairs filled a simple conference area, and a long table held coffee and light snacks. Most of the people there were entrepreneurs discussing early-stage projects that sounded both ambitious and uncertain. I spent the first hour quietly listening to conversations around me before finally introducing myself to a small group discussing creative software tools. As the discussion unfolded, I explained the collaboration platform I had been developing. For the first time in a long while, no one laughed politely or redirected the conversation away from my ideas. Instead, several people leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Among them was a man who listened more carefully than anyone else in the room. He introduced himself as Victor Kane, an investor known for supporting unconventional technology startups. When I finished describing the platform, Victor studied me for a moment and asked a single question that changed everything. He wanted to know if I truly believed the system could transform how designers worked across the country. I answered honestly that I did. Victor nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected, and said that conviction mattered more than perfect timing. Then he asked if I would be willing to show him a full demonstration of the platform the following week. The following week arrived faster than I expected, and with it came a quiet mixture of excitement and uncertainty that kept me awake most of the night before meeting Victor Kane again. I spent hours reviewing every feature of the platform I had built, refining small details, and rehearsing the explanation I planned to give. My apartment looked less like a home and more like a temporary command center, with notes spread across the desk and diagrams covering the wall beside the window. By morning, the city outside was already moving with its usual rhythm of taxis and commuters, and I realized that this meeting might be the most important conversation I had ever had about my work. Victor had chosen a small conference room inside an investment office near Bryant Park. The building itself was modern and understated, with glass walls that allowed sunlight to fill the space. When I arrived, Victor was already seated at the table reviewing a tablet. He greeted me with the same calm curiosity I remembered from the networking event and asked if I was ready to show him what I had been building. I connected my laptop to the display screen and began the demonstration, explaining how the platform allowed designers to organize projects, communicate with clients in real time, and manage revisions without the confusion of endless email threads and file attachments. As the presentation continued, Victor remained silent, watching the screen with careful attention while occasionally asking short, precise questions. None of his questions felt dismissive or skeptical. Instead, they focused on how the system might scale, how teams could adopt the platform across different industries, and how the technology might evolve if the concept proved successful. By the time I finished, nearly an hour had passed. I expected a polite response followed by a suggestion that the idea still required years of development. Instead, Victor leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me with an expression that suggested he had already made a decision. He said that most investors spend their careers searching for two things: a real problem and a person determined enough to solve it. According to Victor, my platform addressed a problem that millions of creative professionals faced every day. The only question left was whether I was prepared to turn the idea into a company rather than a personal project. His words hung in the quiet room for a moment before he continued. Victor explained that early-stage companies rarely begin with perfect systems or guaranteed outcomes. They begin with belief, discipline, and the willingness to work longer and harder than anyone expects. Then he placed a simple proposal on the table. If I was serious about building the platform as a full company, he was willing to provide the first round of funding necessary to develop it properly. The investment would allow me to hire a small development team and begin testing the system with real users across the country. I remember sitting there in silence for several seconds as the weight of that opportunity settled into my mind. For years, the idea had lived quietly inside my apartment and inside notebooks that no one else had read. Now someone with the resources to make it real was asking if I was ready to take the risk. When I finally answered Victor, my voice was calm but certain. I told him that I had been ready for a long time. Victor Kane moved quickly once the decision was made, and the pace of the following months felt unlike anything I had experienced before. The quiet apartment that once held nothing but a desk and a collection of notebooks slowly transformed into the first unofficial headquarters of a company that did not yet have a name, but already carried enormous expectations. Within weeks, Victor helped assemble a small development team, people who understood software architecture far better than I did and who immediately saw the potential in the platform I had spent years designing. We began meeting every morning around the same dining table where Daniel and I had once discussed groceries and weekend plans. Now laptops, cables, and diagrams covered the surface as we mapped out the structure of a real product that could serve thousands of designers across the country. The work was relentless but exhilarating. Days stretched into long evenings as we refined the interface, improved collaboration tools, and tested early versions of the system with small groups of freelance creatives willing to try something new. The feedback from those first users was more encouraging than I had dared to hope. Many of them described the platform as the first tool that truly simplified their workflow, reducing hours of scattered communication into one organized environment. That reaction gave the entire team a sense that we were building something meaningful rather than simply experimenting with technology. As the platform improved, Victor began introducing me to other investors who specialized in early-stage companies. Each meeting carried the same mixture of anticipation and pressure, yet I found myself growing more confident every time I explained the vision behind the system. What had once been a fragile idea in a notebook was now a working platform supported by real users and a small team dedicated to improving it every day. Within a year, the company officially launched under the name Canvas Bridge, a platform designed to connect creative professionals and clients in a single collaborative environment. The launch did not happen with dramatic headlines or television interviews. Instead, it began quietly as designers shared the tool with colleagues and studios that needed a better way to manage projects. Growth arrived gradually at first, then accelerated in ways none of us fully predicted. Agencies in Chicago and Los Angeles began adopting the platform for internal projects. Independent artists across the country signed up after hearing about the system through professional communities. Each new user revealed additional ways the platform could expand, and our small development team worked tirelessly to keep up with the demand. Victor often reminded me that the early stage of a company is less about comfort and more about endurance. There were nights when I slept only a few hours before returning to the office, fueled by the understanding that every improvement brought the platform closer to fulfilling the promise I had described during that first demonstration. 2 years after the day Victor placed his proposal on the conference table, CanvasBridge had grown from a quiet apartment project into a rapidly expanding technology company with offices overlooking the same Manhattan skyline I used to see from my window in Brooklyn. Investors who had once ignored my emails now scheduled meetings weeks in advance, eager to discuss partnerships and long-term strategy. Yet through all of that growth, one truth remained clear in my mind. The future I was building no longer depended on anyone else's belief. It was the result of the quiet nights, the careful persistence, and the moment I decided that someone else's expectations would never again define the limits of my life. The growth of CanvasBridge changed my life in ways that were both exhilarating and overwhelming, but the transformation did not happen overnight. Success arrived in layers, each milestone quietly building on the one before it. By the third year, the platform had expanded far beyond the small community of freelance designers who first tested it. Creative agencies across the country began integrating the system into their daily workflow, praising the simplicity of a platform that finally allowed clients, designers, and project managers to collaborate without endless confusion. Venture capital firms started calling regularly, requesting meetings that only a year earlier would have been impossible to schedule. The company moved into a larger office overlooking Midtown Manhattan, a space filled with engineers, designers, and support teams who believed in the mission just as strongly as I did. Every time I stepped into that office, I felt a quiet reminder of how far the idea had traveled from the small desk beside the Brooklyn window where it began. Victor Kane remained a steady presence throughout that journey. He never attempted to control the company or reshape the vision behind it. Instead, he offered guidance during the moments when the weight of rapid growth threatened to overwhelm the team. He often reminded me that the most powerful companies are built not by chasing recognition, but by solving real problems consistently over time. That philosophy shaped every major decision we made as CanvasBridge continued expanding into new industries. 5 years after the platform officially launched, the company reached a milestone that few startups ever achieve. A major international investment group offered to lead a funding round that valued CanvasBridge at more than $1 billion. I remember the quiet moment when the final agreement was signed in a conference room overlooking Central Park. The skyline outside the windows glowed under late afternoon sunlight, while a handful of executives shook hands around the polished table. For them, the valuation represented another successful investment. For me, it represented the culmination of years spent believing in an idea that once existed only in private notebooks. News of the funding spread quickly through business publications and technology networks. Interviews followed, invitations arrived for conferences and charity events, and the name CanvasBridge began appearing regularly in conversations about the future of digital collaboration. Yet the recognition that mattered most did not come from headlines. It came from the emails and messages sent by designers who described how the platform had changed the way they worked and connected with clients across different cities. Those messages reminded me why the company existed in the first place. As CanvasBridge continued to grow, Victor suggested hosting a charity gala that would bring together investors, technology leaders, and creative professionals to support educational programs for young designers entering the industry. The idea felt like a natural extension of everything the company represented. The event would celebrate creativity while raising funding for opportunities that had never been available to people like me when I first began sketching ideas late at night. Planning for the gala took months, and by the time the invitations were sent across New York's business and cultural circles, the event had quietly become one of the most anticipated gatherings of the year. What none of the guests realized when they accepted those invitations was that the evening would eventually bring two very different versions of my past into the same room. The evening of the gala arrived with the kind of quiet anticipation that New York reserved for its most significant events. The Astoria Grand Hotel had hosted countless celebrations over the decades, but that night the ballroom carried a different kind of energy. Tall crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors, while musicians played soft classical melodies near the stage. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd with silver trays of sparkling water and champagne, and conversations blended into a steady hum of voices filled with curiosity and admiration. Guests began arriving shortly after 7 o'clock, stepping out of black cars beneath the hotel's grand entrance and walking through tall glass doors into a room that reflected the power and elegance of the city itself. Technology founders stood beside museum directors. Venture capital partners spoke with fashion executives, and creative professionals from across the country mingled with philanthropists who had come to support the foundation we had established for young designers. The purpose of the evening was simple but meaningful. Cambridge had reached a point where giving back felt like the natural next step, and the gala would raise funding for scholarships that allowed talented students from modest backgrounds to study design and digital technology. Victor Kane moved through the ballroom greeting investors and longtime partners with the relaxed confidence of someone who understood how far the company had come. Occasionally, he glanced toward the stage where I would soon deliver the opening remarks, offering a quiet nod that reminded me the evening belonged not only to the company, but also to the community that had helped build it. I spent the early part of the evening speaking with guests near the center of the room, thanking people for attending and listening to their stories about how the platform had influenced their work. Despite the size of the event, the atmosphere felt surprisingly personal. Designers who once worked alone from small studios now discussed collaborations with agencies in other states. Investors described how creative technology had become one of the most dynamic industries in the country. As the room filled, the staff dimmed the lights slightly to signal that the main program would begin soon. That was when a familiar name appeared on the guest list tablet held by the event coordinator standing beside me. At first, the name meant nothing more than another attendee arriving among hundreds of others. But when I looked more closely, the letters arranged themselves into a memory I had not visited in years. Daniel Hayes. For a moment, I simply stood there absorbing the quiet surprise of seeing it again after so much time. The coordinator mentioned that he had just entered the ballroom with his wife and was making his way toward the reception area. The words passed through the room like any ordinary update, yet they carried an unexpected weight that only I could feel. Across the ballroom, I saw the entrance doors open again as another pair of guests stepped inside under the glow of chandelier light. The man adjusted his jacket while scanning the room with casual curiosity, unaware that the evening he had just walked into would soon reconnect him with a version of the past he believed had disappeared long ago. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes paused just inside the entrance, as if adjusting to the brightness of the room. From where I stood near the center of the reception floor, I could see the familiar posture immediately, the way he straightened his shoulders and scanned the space with the quiet confidence of someone used to professional gatherings. Time had changed small details, but not the overall presence. The dark suit was carefully tailored, the movements precise, and beside him walked a woman with the polished elegance that suggested she was accustomed to events like this. Charlotte Hayes, if the memory of the coordinator's voice was correct. She held his arm lightly, while looking around the ballroom with open admiration, clearly impressed by the scale of the evening. Around them, the atmosphere remained lively and unaware of the quiet history now standing near the entrance. Guests continued speaking with one another, waiters passed through the crowd offering drinks, and the musicians shifted gently into another piece as the program prepared to begin. Daniel's attention drifted across the room with casual curiosity, pausing occasionally on clusters of people he recognized from business circles. It was clear that he had come expecting a typical charity gala, the kind of elegant event that New York hosted almost every weekend. He could not yet know that the evening had been organized by someone whose life had once been closely connected to his own. For several seconds, I simply watched the scene unfold from across the room, feeling an unexpected calm settle into my thoughts. The past no longer carried the emotional weight it once did. Years of building the company had quietly transformed the memory of that Brooklyn apartment into something distant, almost like a chapter from a book that belonged to someone else. Still, the moment carried a quiet symmetry that I could not ignore. The same man who once believed my ambitions would never leave a notebook was now standing in a ballroom created by the success of those ambitions. Daniel and Charlotte began moving slowly through the crowd, greeting acquaintances and exchanging polite introductions with other guests. A few investors recognized him, and welcomed the couple into small conversations near the reception area. From the way he spoke and smiled, it was clear that he still carried the same professional confidence that had once impressed everyone around him. Yet as the room continued filling and the lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the evening's opening remarks, I noticed something change in his attention. The large digital screen behind the stage had begun displaying a short introduction about the foundation and the company that sponsored the event. Images of CanvasBridge offices, design studios, and community workshops appeared one after another while guests gradually turned their attention toward the front of the ballroom. Daniel glanced toward the screen just as one of the final slides appeared, showing a photograph taken during a recent conference where I had spoken about the future of creative collaboration. The distance between the screen and the entrance was not far, and recognition traveled across his expression slowly but unmistakably. I watched the moment arrive in his eyes as he looked from the photograph on the screen back across the ballroom, toward the stage area, where I stood waiting for the evening to begin.